Welcome back to another Addy Hour episode. As always, it's just my honor and pleasure to continue to host these conversations. And we do like to change things up a little bit in terms of the topics that we talk about. So today we want to bring in a conversation about immigration, culture, faith, and mental health. And so today I'm honored to be able to welcome UJ Harris to the Addy Hour podcast. I'm going to give him a little bit of an introduction so you all know a little bit about him. Some of you may be familiar with him from his book, which would be outstanding. For those who aren't, UJ Harris is a passionate fan of mental and emotional health and how it intersects with faith. He is the president of Psychology for All, which is a Charlotte, North Carolina-based nonprofit that works to drive mental health care equity and access for under-resourced people. He's a father, an encourager, and a contributing author to the book Liberia's Son, which captures the story of his family's resilient journey from a civil war in Liberia to navigating opportunities and challenges and life in the U.S. So I know that's something that we'll unpack as we go through the conversation today. But again, just want to welcome UJ to the program here today. Thanks for being here, UJ.
Thank you so much for having me, Nia. I'm super proud to be part of this opportunity.
Thanks so much. And this has been a long time coming in a lot of different ways. So
yeah,
good to see it come to fruition. I should mention, even though it pains me as a Duke graduate to mention that you got an MBA from UNC Chapel Hill. That is part of your path. And I know you have a BA in psychology.
We'll see y'all Saturday, man. We'll see y'all Saturday. We'll just leave it at that.
Oh my goodness.
And I also got to give a shout out to my two Davidson Wildcats. I'm a Davidson grad as well. Had some love for those people.
Yeah, excellent, excellent.
Thank you for allowing me to hang out at Davidson, to the folks who ever let me in there.
I think that was a good call on their part. So obviously, people have heard a little bit about you in that introduction, and we'll definitely jump into that as the conversation unfolds. But as you know, as my listeners know, I do always like to check in and just see how our guests are doing at this point in time. So, we're finishing up February, entering March of 2023, and just wanted to ask how you're doing at this point in time, life-wise, and just with everything we're navigating as a society.
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's sort of like, how are you really doing, right? This is not the just give you the friendly answer. Things are actually going pretty well. The last couple of years, as you can imagine, we're pretty interested in a lot of adjustments, with the pandemic, but things are settling well, and I'm doing well. I feel like our life is pretty stable. I'm gonna say drama-free. So it's I jokingly say it's good to be UJ right now, and I'm thankful for that. So for asking, brother.
That's good to hear. Yeah, especially as you've mentioned just the honesty of having to navigate through different things. One thing I didn't mention for our listeners too, I mean, you have the Psychology for All organization, but then you're also the vice president of a customer and market research consultancy. So how is that journey in terms of navigating, and I don't know if balancing is the right word. I usually use the word juggling, but how is that aspect of your life at this point in time?
Yeah, it's interesting. People think, because I talk about my nonprofit so much, I think that there are people who know me and think that that's my full-time job. And because it is a passion of mine. It went from something that I was doing as a volunteer to now something that I see more as a real necessity, in some way, almost as a ministry, to use a term. But it's great. I in my corporate job sort of gives me, allows me to sort of plow my skills as a marketer and someone who likes to solve business problems and then sort of manage relationships, in terms of clients. And then the nonprofit really allows me to do something that is more of a passion that I think truly makes a real difference in people's lives. And so it's a good balance. Some people will say, hey, why couldn't you just find something that allows you to do both? Well, if you can, great. But it's working out pretty well for me, where I can sort of have both corporate and nonprofit passion work, and I feel pretty balanced.
Yeah. And that's refreshing to hear the reality too, even though it sounds like, some people question or give some pushback, but just to know, there's different ways to kind of bring those passions and vocations together. So that's encouraging to hear how you've done that in your own life as well.
Yeah, that's been great. I mean, you don't have to, I think, you don't have to necessarily try to make your nonprofit or this passion thing a full-time job. If you can, you should, but quite often it's a little bit challenging in terms of the economics, the income, the compensation, and so forth. You can still do it. You can still do it and do it well, and maintain. At least that's what I've shown. I've been able to sort of do in my life, and I really like that balance. Although I've talked to people who kind of feel like, well, hey, if I could, I would do this full time, but it doesn't quite work out in terms of being able to pay the bills. And I'm like, well, why don't you just kind of have two? You got two hands, right? You're balancing a lot yourself, right, Neat?
I'm juggling a lot. I don't know if I've gotten balance yet. I mean, I would say it ebbs and flows, and people often ask me that. So it kind of just depends on like even certain time periods of the year, like whether, the research is really the heavy emphasis, whether, some of the diversity, equity, inclusion work is heavy emphasis, whether the
Yeah,
podcast, public facing.
right,
And
right.
so that there's some flexibility that comes there too. But like it just is like at this point in time, it seems like it's the most effective way to do things with so many different teams working in different entities. But
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
and it's definitely a learning process. I'll say
Yeah, no,
I
I
haven't
like the way you
mastered
said
it.
it. Not right. It's not balancing; it's juggling. I think you're right.
Yeah. Yeah.
Balancing. Right about that. Good call.
One question that I anticipate, or I would imagine some people might be thinking, people who are maybe trying to think about nonprofit versus something in the private sector and academic sectors, and listening to you talk about how you're doing both, do you ever feel like you have to sacrifice one or the other?
Yeah, wow, that's a that's a good question. Yeah, I mean, at times, the demands they're not always the same. So there are times I think where I have to work a little bit more, especially with a nonprofit because it's a volunteer thing. I don't get paid for that, so
Hmm.
it's all just driven in this belief in that the belief that I have in this cause that mental health should be accessible to everyone.
Hmm.
What you did despite your race, your ability to pay, income, whatever identifiers you have. But so there are times I think I have to sort of work a little harder to kind of stay energized and keep things moving with our organization. The work is the work. You got you got to pay the
Yeah.
bills, so you can't switch off on that as much at all.
Yeah.
But I think there are certainly times where it seems like I have to put a little bit more than I
Mm.
would want to keep the work going with the nonprofit.
Yeah. That's,
Yeah,
I mean, I think that's a healthy and helpful perspective too, for those who may also be trying to think about that, or people who might be just finishing up with school and trying to think about those next steps. So definitely
yeah,
appreciate you sharing that too.
yeah.
And like I mentioned, we'll definitely lean into your life story as that's, a piece of your journey as well. But before we get there, I did want to ask a little bit about just the nonprofit and how that came about, how that passion, in a sense developed.
Yeah, it's actually tied with my story. So I lived through a
Hmm.
civil war in Liberia. So I think I mentioned you mentioned my sort of the book Liberia Son, which was a collaboration with a dear friend of mine, David Verhagen, or Dave Verhagen, sort of telling that story.
Hmm.
But living through the Civil War, when I came to the U.S. In 1991, I don't know. As I sort of going to school, I found myself really fascinated by behavior and sort of why I did the things I did. And I'm not sure like how many 15, 16-year-old walking around sort of asking this question, like, why am I the way I am? You know what I mean? And why are
Mm.
people the way they are? But I had that interest, that sort of that fascination. Um, and that led me to studying psychology in college. And then as I sort of started to learn more about this idea of trauma and resilience and all of those things that come with just sort of growing up and maturing through difficult circumstances, I saw a lot of value in mental health and in mental and emotional wellness. So I I kind of connected with some folks who were counselors and therapists in the area, and a group of folks saw the gap in access for mental health care, and they decided to start this organization. And I knew some of those folks and got involved through sort of the relationships we had. And I've been involved since 2015. And I think it was launched officially, and then probably a few months later, I got involved, and I've been involved since. And it's just become something that I truly value. Mental health is one of those things. I think you know this better than I do. It's super important, but yeah, there's either low awareness or there are just some hurdles to people really engaging it and seeing that as a critical part of what I think Dr. Daniel Amen calls whole body health, right?
Hmm.
Spiritual, emotional, mental, and physical.
Yeah, that's
But yeah,
that's that's beautiful to hear. Just, I mean, the passion and the drive there. I mean, obviously that definitely resonates with me, and I am impressed that you were thinking about that as a 15-year-old.
yeah, I don't know. Yeah, I must have got hit on the head, or something. But it was just one of those things that's always been fascinating. I still see the world interested enough through sort of that mental and emotional kind of health lens, in terms
Hmm.
of behaviors and understand sort of root causes going below the waterline to see sort of what's at the base of the iceberg, as I like to say.
Hmm.
And I think I find that really interesting.
Yeah, and that's so important. And it seems like I mean, you're just tying together things you were seeing in other people's lives as you were here in the US, but then also perhaps even reflecting back on your own experience as
Absolutely.
well.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you could just share with our listeners as much as you're willing to, just your childhood experience, both before the Civil War and after. And even before we
Yeah.
go there, I'll put in a little caveat.
Okay.
As a son of immigrants as well, but as someone who grew up in the US, knowing that these aren't the things that are taught in US history. So actually, if you can also give our listeners just a little bit of context about the history of Liberia and
Oh
how
yeah.
these things
Oh
came
man.
about.
Okay.
I know I'm throwing a
So,
lot out, a
yeah,
lot
you're
out
like
there.
there are a lot of, I've been in the U.S. A lot longer than I was in, probably two times as long
Mm,
as I was in Liberia. But I still keep my Liberian card.
mm,
If anybody wants to question that. But so Liberia was founded by basically freed slaves, so freed American slaves. So
mhm,
at some point after the Emancipation Proclamation, and there were people, there were a bunch of folks who made the choice to go back to resettle in Africa, and they resettled in West Africa, and created this country we know as Liberia. The capital city is Monrovia. Never was an American official sort of colony, but very strong ties with the U.S. We speak English there, and it's not going to sound like English if you pull up if I started talking my real Liberian accent, or talk
mm,
if you're talking to a true Liberian. But we definitely speak English. We some of the values, I think, of our countries is American, as you can imagine, because the former slaves brought those things there, as some of the food, some of the dressing, the style, and all those things. So strong ties with the U.S. So outside of Liberia, I think the most Liberians, I would say, are in America,
mm,
in the U.S. Childhood was pretty fun. I grew up with my mom, my brother, and then we had a lot of such family around. So kind of a true village mentality.
mhm.
Every weekend seemed like it was a family reunion. It's one of those things that, and in here you have these family reunions that are once or twice a year, because everyone is so spread out.
Yep.
It's every weekend. I mean, the aunts, the uncles, the grandparents all came, and it was just a wonderful village. Grew up with a lot of love, a lot of affection, a lot of validation, a lot of affirmation. In right outside of the city, Monrovia. Went to private school, and went to one of the better schools in Liberia. So my mom really was big on education, and so that was something she pushed, and as you can tell, it sort of stayed with us even till now. So you had a really good life in Liberia. I think I remember when I first moved to the U.S. I really missed the life, the pre-war Liberia a lot,
Mm,
and it probably took me a couple of years to really start to embrace all the opportunities and all the blessings of being in America. But things were certainly different. Not starting with the weather. One of the things I remember really sort of spooked me was seeing kids with braces.
mm.
Just like what that was just so bizarre to me. I thought you guys had some aliens here or something like that. And no, some braces really freaked me out. But
Wow.
life was really fun in Liberia. I enjoy my life growing up, and really thankful for the family and the community we had, and that love and that support um, that I grew up with. I think really became sort of fuel for a lot of the things that would come on later in my life.
Mm,
There's real value in growing up with a lot of love and support and validation and affirmation. I think that gives you confidence.
mm,
And as a dad myself, that's something that there are a lot of things I want to give my kids, but just sort of those things I mentioned with love and affirmation and validation. And I mean, those are definitely the core things I want to give to my kids. Because you can teach them how to make money, how to do a lot of things, but I think those foundational things are really ultimately, I think, what makes the big difference, in my opinion. And
mhm.
that's really just my opinion, of course.
Yeah, no, that speaks volumes as well. And I think it's so healthy for people to hear about, one, the history, because it's not taught enough, and just about the family and community structure that you had there. And in some ways, I know you've gone to this in your book as you talk about all the experiences of the Civil War, from not really realizing how serious things were to the realities that hit at other points. Even
Yeah.
as you're talking just now, it makes me think about, people like to talk about resilience, and where that comes from, and whether it's biological. But even as you were talking, just thinking about the structure and the support system that you have from an early age, like that is just like, I can just hear it in your voice and your comments about how important that was. And it makes me wonder what role that actually played in your story overall as well.
Yeah, since I got more involved with sort of with understanding mental health, and
Hmm.
especially with trauma, because we lived through some pretty difficult things. And there was an interview I did with another on another show where the person, and this was somebody I knew, and she said, you know, we never saw any sort of weird things about you guys, being guys, being kids who had grown up in the war. There was nothing weird, where we thought, huh, those guys are clean, they've been shaped somehow by this traumatic experience, or, because I think that was because of this. We didn't go through this alone. We, my brother Jerry and I, we had this community around us, and I think that before there were therapists and all these different tools and resources we have now around mental health, people were going through difficult things and surviving based on their faith and their community, right? And I think that as I look back, I realized, oh yeah, we had those things. That's why I can, I'll be happy to take any test, but I've taken a few tests to say I'm pretty okay, not local, not crazy or anything, kind of a normal person, and but no sort of outsized behaviors one way or the other that at least that I've been told of or anything. But that community and that I mentioned was a big part of it, and so apparently that's maybe you know this better than I do, but that it's sort of strong faith community, strong sort of supportive community makes a huge difference in how people weather different storms in life.
Yeah, no, that's definitely true, and it's encouraging to hear you share that from a real life experience too. I mean, the evidence definitely points to that when people are looking at things socially in terms of things that have happened in certain communities, that both in terms of negative impacts it can have on that community, but how the community bonding together can actually help navigate through that. And then going all the way back to the biology as well. I mean, even studies which I've shared before, that people have done in rodents, looking at rats and mice, if they're in community and they're going through things together, how they'll show empathy towards one another, how some of the biology is involved in that. People talk about oxytocin being one of those molecules that's important for that, and how that helps them actually navigate through. So, I mean, you can see that all the way from the basic biology all the way up to the clinical literature and some of the community-based literature. So it definitely makes an impact. And even as we're talking about faith communities as well, just even that first pass, again, a little bit anecdotal, but so many different stories of just the importance of having people to talk with or experience those things with and listen to, just as that first pass. Not even if people are maybe not even having quote unquote counseling, certified counseling, or a certified social worker or therapy, but just that first step of listening and walking through. Like, there's so many examples and evidence how important that can be to helping people navigate through.
Absolutely. And I'm learning that more and more. And I think over the years of, talking to folks like you and learning, working with a nonprofit, I think I'm getting what I would call the language to process the things we experience and the things we had in our, sort of living through a civil war.
And how would you say that's and you're hinting at this already, but how's that informing your work with Psychology for All even now? I mean, your own experience and what you've seen, the strength of the community, how it's helped you through, how's that inform what you do day to day and going forward?
Yeah, I know. I think it's really given me a passion, for it now as I've gotten a little older. When I first started doing this, I think it was more of it seems interesting. I have an interest in it. Doing this, being sort of being involved with a nonprofit with Psychology for All, it was an interest. It was something that sort of made sense, something that it was a good thing to do. But now, as I sort of reflect on my story and my journey, it's become more of it's become more of a passion and more of and I used the word earlier, ministry, where I think it's in the faith circle you talk about sort of brokenness, and I see this opportunity to be part of bringing healthy change to some things we might call some broken areas in our community, in our lives. And all the books I've read, all the therapy and everything I've been through, I always like to say this: I was patient zero, whatever the term. It wasn't about trying to fix anybody else or change anybody's lives. It was more about, okay, I want to make sure that I'm healthy, that I'm bringing my best, especially as a dad and everything like that. And then now I realize, okay, because I see the benefits, I want to be part of at least making folks aware of it. Obviously, everyone chooses what they want to do. So, but it's definitely, my story's become an integral part of my approach and sort of what shapes the lens through which I see the work we do with Psychology for All.
That's great. That's so important. Also, I'm curious because I know that some may be listening and are feeling really encouraged from hearing your story and about the strength of the community and some of the resilience. But others may also be thinking, okay, well, I know people who also went through difficult situations and maybe had that community. They didn't seem, things still seem to be difficult for them. Or someone who went through a traumatic experience and didn't have a good, strong community or felt isolated. And so, how, even knowing your own experience and what you've done so far, what would you say to someone like that in terms of some of the access and mental health advocacy work that you do?
Yeah, I think they're your community is really, I mean, you get to kind of, you can, in a lot of ways you can create your community. Quite often you think, well, it's my family and the people sort of within my neighborhood or my zip code, or if you're, if you live in somewhere, in certain places, your village, your town, or whatever.
Hmm.
But what community is really more, for me, I think the people who sort of have the shared values, and who are going to sort of walk alongside you, right, and
Hmm.
support you. And so if your community, as sort of as it looks like right now, is isn't offering the support you need, yeah, definitely, I would say expand your community. One of the things that I had grown up, and you may be familiar with this, just a lot of mentors, and I used to say, I joke and I say I had multiple mamas. So different, you meet
Hmm.
these some of your mom's friends or older women who just were like, they sort of took you on as their son or something. They were supportive, or mentors, um, who became part of that community, and provided some of that support and that affirmation, that accountability, and all the things I needed. So my comment to those folks would be, yeah, sort of expand your community a little bit, go beyond sort of the confounds of what your community looks like now, and find those people, who can be sort of the supportive folks, and they're out there. They are out there. There are plenty of, obviously, there are organizations out there that have mentors, and are provide mentoring services and other things. And then, but whether it's a church, a club, YMCA, different affinity groups, a hobby, there's so many different places now to find supportive community. I think, and but I don't know. I
No,
don't
that's
know if
good. That's good.
if that makes sense to you as in your
Yeah.
professional capacity.
Yeah, I mean, I think those are really wise words too, especially as you defined it early on. If that's not happening within the community, people have a right to be able to and be willing to look elsewhere and
Yeah.
to be able to get that support of people who have that like mindset. So I think that's really, really important that you shared that, and really, really helpful advice. Also curious, because I know you've mentioned faith and faith communities as well, a few times. So how is that? What's that aspect of your journey? What has that looked like, and how's that continue to play a role?
Yeah. Wow. So I don't know if we could have survived the Civil War in Liberia, and we lived through some pretty scary things
Hmm.
for a period of time there, in terms of just escaping firefights, being held at gunpoint, excuse me, a few times, dealing with starvation and food shortages. I mean, there were a lot of scary things, but
Hmm.
we always had our faith in in God, and just in prayer. And I've come to find that the Bible is probably one of the best, if not the best, book of mental health, actually. And this is, I don't know, too many people agree with that, but as you sort of read the Bible and really get to know the stories, and you think about the trauma that Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, or David, or Joseph. I mean, the people went through some really, and of course Jesus himself, of course, it's really difficult things, and you see how those difficult things, the arc of those things, led to victory. What posthumously, or while they were still alive. And I thought, and so those things became sort of part of our how we lived our lives. And yeah, it's a big part of faith. It's almost like I can't see my life without my faith
Hmm.
in God. I really can't. I may not be, as I always say this to my mom, she probably doesn't like me say that. I may not be the best Christian, right? I have to be honest with myself, but I do believe. And my whatever little faith I have, I think, continues to make just a huge difference in how I navigate the ups and downs and the
Hmm.
vicissitudes of life, for sure.
Mm. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's really powerful. I mean, I appreciate even the way that you just frame that, even how you read through the narratives in the Bible and the mental health arc that's there, that I don't think we always give as much acknowledgement or credit to as we should, about how difficult a lot of those circumstances were. So that's really,
Yeah, they seem like stories, but they're real. And then when
Hmm.
you start to find yourself in those stories, you realize, oh yeah, okay,
Yeah.
yeah, you can sort of go through the same process and come on the other side and be resilient and be a victor, and so forth.
Yeah. Yeah. Really powerful. And so many aspects of community within those stories as well, even as you were talking about in your own experience. I mean, there's so many parallels there and things that we can definitely learn along the way. And to push on that a little bit, I know you talked about your faith in God and just reading through those stories, the practice of prayer. How has the community of faith, has that also been part of the journey as well?
Yeah, it's definitely, yeah. And as I mentioned, in Liberia, we had, when we were living through the war, and well, prior to that, we were part of a church, and
Mm,
used to host a Bible study at our home, and so we had that community, and and then even when we lived through the war, we still had that faith community, so people we
mm,
could read the Bible with and pray with, and even just talk through sort of the experiences we're having, and
mm,
encourage one another, and that okay, you know what, God can see us through this, and we're just going to continue to trust Him. Obviously, um, some people made it, and some people didn't make it, and who, why that happened that way. I don't know, but we certainly, our faith community really was important, and it was kind of the perfect. I don't call it therapy or whatever, but to help us navigate what was a very difficult time, and that's become really true even through now. And I've had other challenges in my life, whether it's health or family, and I've been able to. That faith community has always been there to kind of give me the strength to sort of see my way through whatever the obstacles were.
yeah. Again, just so powerful and sobering at the same time. I know, depending on when we're talking, where we're talking about faith, either here in the US or different parts of the world, it can look very different in different situations. And knowing that in some situations, people are navigating through a whole host of challenges that
Yeah,
sometimes some of us in the States can't even relate to.
yeah,
People who have had to become refugees or take
yep,
asylum because of all these things, and always to hear stories of people holding on to their faith in the midst of those challenging situations. And even as you mentioned, not everybody made it, but how that was such a bedrock and a foundation, I think
yeah,
is so powerful and something that I hope we're paying more and more attention to in general, but then also just in terms of how it affects our lives, how it affects our mental health. And so again, it's just powerful, encouraging, and sobering to hear you kind of walk through those pieces of your story as well.
yeah. It's cool.
So I'm going to pivot a little bit because I know, and as you know, we pull in a lot of topics on this podcast, and we're
Yeah,
getting to that already. We've already talked about some of the culture and mental health and faith. But in terms of race, that was another topic that I wanted to kind of talk through as well,
yeah,
especially
yeah,
with everything that's happened in the last few years. But then also knowing that conversations about race are different and overlapping in different parts of the world. So
yeah.
I'd be, just curious if you'd share with our listeners your perspective on race and race relations, both from the context of Liberia. And for those who are listening, UJ's smiling right now, so I'm sure he has a lot to share. But both from the context of Liberia, and then the States, and then there's some comparisons we might jump into later, even from my own
Sure.
experience. But I'll
You,
leave it there for now,
yeah,
not
you
to
threw
open up
that
too
out there.
much.
That's a pretty heavy in terms of. I'm thinking, am I supposed to dunk this thing, or am I going to barely get the rim thing, man? But it's so. I will say that in Liberia, we had tribes,
Hmm. Yeah.
right, which and I know I don't think a lot of people are familiar with sort of this idea of tribes, but they're essentially just subgroups within the country, and we had
Hmm.
different dialects. We call them dialects, or languages, and you may have to add a better context and to some of this stuff here, but I'm just going to kind of explain the way
Yeah.
I know it. And so my family was from one tribe, and but we were all obviously dark skinned black people,
Hmm.
but you notice there were sort of stereotypes and differences based on what tribes you came from, right?
Hmm.
Uh, and so I had a tribal context, and but then coming to the U.S. now you've got a skin color racial context, which is a
Hmm.
little, which is different. And I grew up when I came here. I sort of grew up in a very predominantly white world, and
Hmm.
a friend of mine who's jokingly said that I was white socialized. Like, yeah, I guess. Okay, but
Hmm.
so going to a prep school, prep college and schools that where there were not a lot of Black and brown people,
Mm-hmm.
and really enjoyed those experiences.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely love those experiences and the values they sort of inculcated me with, and so I have no regrets. But it was not till college that I really started to understand myself that I started to explore myself as a Black man in America and what that really meant.
Mm-hmm.
So, and that was an interesting experience. So I took some African American lit classes and did readings of Ralph Ellison and Derek Bell and Dubois and all these different and then some Cornell West and Skip and Henry Louis Gates. I mean, like that's when I really I was what, 19 years old.
Mm.
When I started to kind of go through this self-actualization of, oh, I'm a Black man in America. That's different from being a Black man in Africa, in Liberia, and learning that, and then trying to sort of embrace that and still be true to the fact that I grew up in what people might, I call it American, but people might call a white world, and I was very comfortable in that space, and I still am. And then there's this Liberian part of me that I value, and I don't want to lose either. And then there's the African American side of me. So I had to kind of realize, I'm a multicultural person. I never even right? Like, my goodness, okay, I'm a multicultural person. So my view on race is it matters, kind of going from Cornell West book, Race Matters. I think it was one of the first books I read on race, and it is important. And I think there are some beautiful, sort of distinctions that I think makes us as a community better. It is hard for me to sort of to kind of understand the conflicts that we still see here, racially in America. It's something that I don't know how much of it it's more kind of the lenses through which we see the world, and how much of it is the reality of the world. You know what I mean? It's sort of there's a quote I saw not too long ago, from the Talmud, and it said, we see things not as they are, but as we are. Right? And this idea of, okay, what is it that I'm projecting to sort of what's happening around me, and then what is it that's actually true in terms of my actual experience of racism or discrimination or any sort of inequity, So I don't know if I answered your question, but that's my perspective. It's something that I'm growing into more and more, and to understanding, and then hopefully navigating in a healthy way.
Yeah, that's so important. I mean, that quote that you mentioned too, and again, it just ties everything together, because I'm thinking about that both from culture and race in terms of what we perceive versus what is, and how we don't, at least maybe perhaps just in the circles where I am in, we don't have that conversation necessarily about race as much, but we definitely have that conversation when it comes to mental health. I mean, in a sense, that's at the crux of some of the things that we talk about when we're talking about things like depression. What do you perceive, and how is that different from the reality of the situation and what state you're in at that time? But there's such an overlap there. And I think, if as much as we'd be able to have that conversation within the cultural context too, and then to be able to question what we perceive, would actually allow us to move to a better place of understanding and healing.
Yes, absolutely.
Much easier said than done, obviously.
Well, but yes, that you're absolutely right, and thankfully, I think there's more work being done. I think there are more conversations. I would say, being had, I guess, and so my general sense is that the chains are, in terms of like a football analogy, we're moving the chains. But I think maybe some people will probably say, no, we're not. And they'll have their reasons why they think that. I'll have my reasons why I think that too, like why I think what I think, right? So, but
how does that tie in? Because I'm also just thinking about your nonprofit too, and in terms of access, how does that perception versus reality, one, tie in to whether people have access or not, two, I guess, whether they take advantage of that access, and then three, once they get there, if the perception of them is actually accurate, because there's a whole host of evidence that people from Black and brown communities are put into certain mental health categories or diagnoses much more often, whether that's correct or not. So
yeah, man, 3-part question. This is what
let's go one at a time. We'll just do the access first.
Let's go. I
gotta slow down on the academic mode of throwing everything in at once.
Well, I think that in terms of access, I believe there are opportunities there for us to drive more access of with mental health, especially because a lot of folks, the folks we serve, the average income is $10,000, and we so that there's you can't. Therapy is really not cheap. In my experience, and so driving accessibility and for those folks, it's important. I think the perception that maybe folks don't, sort of in Black and brown communities, I think, don't necessarily want to be a part of this and take advantage of of these services. I found it's not exactly true, right? Initially, I've heard I've seen different presentations and read some things about stigma and cultural biases and so forth. We're seeing even in our data, sort of year over year, increasing utilization of our service as people are aware of them, and I think that was sort of a perception versus reality, right? You may think, well, people just they don't want to. People don't want to take advantage of the services. They don't feel like they need it. They've got whatever beliefs they have and whatever communities they have, but no, people want to be healthier. And I think maybe the pandemic was a catalyst. I don't know if I know there's a connection between, the impact between sort of the pandemic and mental health. I don't know if I want to say, and maybe you might know this more empirically, that there's a connection between the pandemic and people seeking mental health care. I don't know that. Probably something to look into. Maybe
it seems that way just from talking to those who are giving clinical services in terms of the number of requests that they're getting. Just anecdotally, I've definitely had those conversations with a lot of folks.
So we saw that with some of our data. But access is an issue. Equity in terms of I saw an image once where it had 3 people at 3 different heights, basically standing on the same kind of stool or whatever, and it was like, well, that's sort of equality. But then they had, and they were trying to look over a fence at something at a ball game. Have you seen this before? And then there was one where, but then you see the next image where it's more equity, where it's like, okay, we're gonna sort of adjust these things so that everybody can actually see it, because even though we're all in the same place, I got an advantage because I'm 6 feet tall and the other person is 5'4". And I thought it was really interesting because it was a great visual on how to think about this idea of equity, which we still have a lot of opportunity to drive in our community, and I'm talking about actually broadly across the country, but certainly where I am here outside of Charlotte, and so that's another opportunity, and I think the perception is that just because there's a sort of what seems like an even playing field, everything that's equitable. Well, it's not. Right. That's something that I'm learning too. So, and the reality is not, and trying to be part of solving that. So hopefully I hit on all 3 parts of your question there.
Yep. Well, I think, you got the first 2, the third one, which I threw in, the curveball at the end was just, and that's too many at once.
Go ahead.
But just in terms of, in terms of how people are assessed or diagnosed when it comes to mental health, and where that, that's a complicated issue in and of itself. I acknowledge that, but just curious, any insights or perspectives you have there.
Well, let me say this. I think everybody is a professor, mental health guy. I am more of a guy who just finds this more about something I'm interested in. I've read a few books, and I just have more sort of a raw passion for it. So I'm not a clinician or anything like that. I just want to put that out there. So anything Nee says, you probably want to listen to it, not too much mine, but
we're gonna put them together.
Put them together. There you go. Perfect. Good team player. I have heard and I've seen that we have sort of disproportional rates of especially our kids being grouped in as having more or less more problems. That is unfortunate, because I think some of that, if it's not done correctly, I think shapes the individual long term, right? And I think what I've learned is that those categorizations do have long-term implications and can almost affect the trajectory of your life. That's what I've seen in my sort of my small sort of space that I operate in here, and I've read a few things like that, and I'm sure you probably can speak to this a little bit more.
Yeah, I think that's 100% on, and just from a scientific lens, even though that's not something I've studied, but have definitely read about, just in terms of developmentally how important those, for lack of a better word, say labels at an early age can actually impact expectations and trajectory, again, think from a neuroscience perspective. So I think, yeah, I think you're exactly right. And it's so important that we actually, one, pay attention to it and actually, do things to make sure that we don't put those things there initially. But then that gets into all the complications about the biases that are in the system or in our own minds as
Yeah.
people, and how we do that without even acknowledging, and in some cases realizing, in some cases not realizing what impact that can have on the upcoming generation. And I say that knowing that my age is increasing as folks seem to be younger, but it's
Yeah.
just so important. I mean, more and more each day I think about the impact of my own choices or words, whether it's with my own kids or kids in
Yeah.
the community or
Yeah.
schools that I'm talking to or college students, and how much that can, not that it's just on me, but each of us who have those roles can actually set trajectory. So I think
Absolutely.
that's
Yeah,
hugely
yeah. I
important.
mean, yeah, labels. I mentioned race matters. Cornel West's book
Mhm.
earlier, and now I'm thinking maybe a labels matter.
Mm,
That
mm,
labels matter, and they really can. And I think, fortunately, going back to my story, I had really healthy labels put on me.
mm,
Smart, kind, affable, those kind of things, and
mm,
loving and loved and all those things. And I think and it's that shaped, again, where I am and the trajectory of my life. And as we're talking now, I realize that I can think of people who had different labels.
mm,
um, you know, Stubborn, difficult, pain in the rear,
mm, mhm.
and stuff like that. And you'd be surprised how people sort of internalize those things by
Yeah,
subconsciously, right? And it
yeah.
shapes it. So yeah, that is a thing. And in our work, we have some in terms of with the nonprofit just screening, trying to making sure that we're working with therapists who are credible and licensed, and some understand some of the nuances of the community we work with. We try to have good representation of people, whether it's bilingual or certain ethnicity and so forth,
Yeah,
to
I think that's,
to bring some sensitivity to those
yeah. Yeah, I think that's so powerful in a lot of ways. And it's, again, I know I said encouraging about 10 times in this conversation, but just to hear the way that you're paying attention to so many different aspects. I mean, both, hearing people's stories, bringing in the mental health experts, also paying attention to culture and background and access aspects of faith. So I mean, it's just I think it's powerful and something that I hope will be replicated in other ways as well. I don't know if that's something, if you've been talking to others in other communities, or if there's some long-term plans to see this in other places in the country, but anything you'd be willing to share on
Yeah,
that.
I would. I think, and I know that one of the things that's great about the mental health space is that the need is so great.
Hmm.
So there are plenty of, and there aren't enough. I don't think we have enough resources. And then even where there are ample resources, there's still an opportunity for us to sort of to be more interconnected. I think
Hmm.
that from what I've seen here and sort of in where we live, there's a the people are the organizations that are trying to tackle mental health, especially in underserved communities, still seem to be operating in silos,
Mm,
and so um, there's an opportunity to drive better connection, which I think will ultimately lead to more efficiency, better care delivery, and ultimately a better service to the people we're trying to help. I would love to see this psychology for all, or that the model that we use where we we don't have therapists who are like employed by us, right? We have a bunch of independent
mm,
therapists who you know choose to partner with us and accept
hmm.
our rate, and then deliver those services to people who can't afford it, who would
Mm,
otherwise be able to afford it. And we've got people who have rates of $500 to people who rates are like $120, but we pay a flat rate of $65. So
mm,
and so we're not our clients get to work with I would say the best. It's not
mm,
some folks who don't know what they're I mean, I would say who don't know what they're doing, but there are opportunities, and it would be
mm,
great to see. We need more organizations, but
hmm,
even more so, I think we need more connectivity between
mm,
organizations in the mental health space.
yeah.
Quite often, I think we got a lot of people doing a lot of things, but as a someone who might be looking for therapy, especially if I'm underprivileged,
Hmm.
where do I start?
Hmm.
I only know of maybe what's in my in my community, or whoever comes to me, but I would love to see a resource where you can just go and look up what you want by race, ethnicity,
Yeah.
specialty, all these things, pull it up, and it doesn't matter you know where people are, and be able to try to find services to meet your needs based on, whatever your specific, I guess interests are.
Yeah, that's huge. I mean, even as you're talking, you're giving me some ideas and thoughts. So we're gonna have to extend this conversation in some ways, and I think there's actually folks I'm gonna try and connect you with as well, because I think that would go such a long way, and it's so needed in so many different ways.
Are you seeing that from your work? That I don't know if I'm allowed to ask you questions, but I guess I
Yeah,
am. Right?
you're good.
Because I see this and I talk to other people here, but I mean, you have obviously a pretty large sort of network. I mean, are you seeing some of that sort of the silo that's operating in sort of individual swim lanes versus sort of collaboration with mental health
Definitely.
service provider? Okay.
Definitely. And I'm trying to be succinct and not go on a whole.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
So
I
I
get
mean,
that.
it happens across all of the spheres, which I talked about in terms of the work. So I mean, this is a little bit, but definitely within the academic circles.
Mm.
The silos definitely happen between institutions. They definitely even happen within institutions as we're thinking about things like diversity, equity, inclusion work. Things happening in silos, things happening in parallel. And so a lot of the work that we've been doing in that role is trying to just open up the conversation and have more collaborative conversations. But it's definitely happening within the mental health space as well. I mean, it's a challenge because there are so many things that are happening in individual communities that are good. But then, as you mentioned, someone might be in a certain situation and not know where to start. So I
Yeah.
do see things, as I've been in this work for the last few years, in different pockets in different places of the country. And those things are effective, but it becomes a matter of how do you kind of galvanize those resources so that it's broader
Yeah.
across the country, and even broader for, I mean, we talk about, things that are important for those of underrepresented backgrounds or Black and Brown communities. So seeing some of the things like I'm forgetting the name, Therapy for Black Girls and some of the organizations, but seeing there are a lot of large organizations, but also a lot of small organizations that could also benefit from having those communities. And so sometimes it becomes many of us individually, and this reinforces it, kind of sending those resources out to people we know, but we still
Right.
need a way to have that be more global. So again, you've got me
Yeah.
thinking in a lot of ways. So
Well, that's definitely something that I have as a business person.
mhm,
I mean, you mentioned I went to business school,
mhm,
UNC, and so got an MBA, and I'm a business guy, and
mhm,
um, I think just that's an opportunity
yeah,
to figure out how to bring so how to skill, right?
mhm,
Because skill the all the different services that are out there
mhm,
in a way that allows us to actually have greater impact. Actually,
yeah, yeah. I think that's well said. Because at the same time, I'm still thankful for the work that you're doing, that so many are doing in different places. But just like you put it, to have even greater impact and to be able to collaborate across groups, I think is really, really important. And I think even push that further, small groups and some of the large organizations. So I mean, we've been fortunate in a sense because coming from a place like Yale sometimes gives us access to some of those larger groups that we can kind of push those conversations in those
right,
places too,
right.
to talk about thinking about aspects of cultural competency or incorporating aspects of faith, even in the questionnaires, if someone's looking for people from different faith backgrounds. So that's been encouraging to see, but
Yeah,
still so much more that needs to be done.
yeah. No, it's what I call a good opportunity. I mean,
Mm,
and I think that it's a fun problem to be part of trying to
mhm.
solve, and because the impact is so significant. I mean, this better than I do. I mean, when you change one person's life in a family, you can also make the network effect of that is hard to quantify.
Yeah,
Yeah. So
yeah,
cool.
really well said. Well, again, thank you for all the work you're doing. Any last thoughts you want to leave the listeners with in terms of like what gives you hope on a day-to-day basis, or even things that you can encourage them to pay attention to going forward?
Yeah, it seems like when you turn on the news now, everything seems so, I don't know, I'll say discouraging.
Mm,
And so what I try to do, and I would say, let's be proactive about finding the good news and finding the good things. And it could be some of the simplest things, like for me, just hanging out with my kids. It's really fun. I started playing pickleball, and which is
oh
the
wow.
fastest growing sport in America, and just getting out, and that's really fun. But yeah, just be intentional about finding things that sort of bring you joy, and put a smile on your face every day, because there's a lot that sort of vying to give you the opposite feeling. So that's what
Yeah,
I'll leave you at that.
really well said. Really well said. I'm
Thank
sure folks will take that to heart. Again, UJ, I just really appreciate you taking the time especially I know you had moved some things around and just to create space. So definitely appreciate you being here. All the words of wisdom that you shared, your honesty about and your vulnerability about your journey and the resilience and community that's been there. I know listeners are going to really be encouraged by this, and hopefully spurred to do some good work as well from hearing what you've been doing.
Thank you so much. I'm a big fan of yours. I respect you. I admire your story, and just respect, my friend. Thank you for the work you're doing.